Hey guys, tonight we journey to the Great Wall of China, a symbol of ancient power but also a monument to unimaginable human suffering. Forget majestic views, we're uncovering the chilling truth of what it was like to be a worker on this colossal, deadly project. It truly, deeply sucked. Before you get too comfortable, please like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and your local time. It's fascinating. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Great Wall of China, an image of a stone dragon across mountains and deserts, immediately springs to mind. It's hailed globally as an unparalleled architectural marvel, a testament to ancient ingenuity and colossal human effort. For centuries, it has symbolized China's strength, a formidable defensive line engineered to repel northern nomadic invaders. Its imposing watchtowers and sprawling fortifications whisper tales of strategic brilliance and an unwavering resolve to protect an empire. This is the Wall of Legend, the icon of imperial might, evoking awe through its sheer scale and the audacity of its construction. It's truly one of history's most ambitious undertakings, a deep wellspring of national pride, recognized worldwide. However, this celebrated image of grandeur and strategic mastery conceals a profoundly darker narrative. The very structure designed to safeguard a nation became, for those who built it, a brutal prison and often a premature grave. Behind every meticulously laid stone, beyond every yard of rammed earth stretching towards the horizon, lies not a tale of glory, but one of intense, unspoken human suffering. For the millions conscripted to labor on its ever-lengthening sections, the Great Wall was no beacon of pride or security. Instead, it was a merciless, insatiable devourer of lives, a project fueled by endless sweat, spilled blood, and silent tears. The myth speaks of its vastness. The reality for its builders was a grueling existence defined by hardship. Who then were the individuals condemned to this fate, the builders of this colossal monument? The labor force was immense and diverse, though seldom voluntary. Soldiers garrisoned at the frontiers were routinely diverted from defense to construction. Convicted criminals, their sentences frequently transformed into lifelong hard labor on the wall, faced a destiny many viewed as more terrifying than execution itself. Yet, the primary source of manpower, the true engine of this massive enterprise, comprised ordinary peasant farmers. Torn from their homes, families, and agricultural livelihoods by imperial decree, millions were force-marched over vast distances to remote, desolate building sites. For these men, the call to build was often a death knell. The conditions these laborers endured were exceptionally harsh, a relentless test of human fortitude. The wall's path dissects some of China's most unforgiving landscapes. Scorching summer heat radiated from barren terrain, causing rampant heatstroke and dehydration among the workers. Conversely, frigid winters brought biting winds and sub-zero temperatures, leading to frostbite and agonizing work. They toiled on treacherous mountain precipices, where one false step invited a fatal plunge, and across arid deserts where sudden sandstorms could blind and suffocate. Adequate shelter was a rarity. They faced the raw, untamed elements daily, with only the most basic tools to aid their monumental tasks. The physical labor demanded was unceasingly brutal. Envision quarrying enormous stones from mountainsides with nothing but rudimentary hammers, chisels, and raw human strength. These massive blocks, along with tons of earth, bricks, and other materials, had to be transported across miles of this punishing terrain. Without modern machinery like cranes or trucks, the burden fell entirely on human shoulders and backs. Laborers formed human chains to move materials up steep inclines and strained to pull overloaded carts. Working hours stretched from dawn till dusk relentlessly, day after day with minimal rest. Malnutrition was rife due to scarce and poor quality food rations, and diseases swept through the crowded, unsanitary work camps. Compounding the environmental challenges and grueling work was the often cruel treatment by overseers. Under immense pressure to meet imperial construction quotas, these supervisors frequently resorted to fear and violence to control the workforce. Beatings were a common disciplinary measure for perceived slowness, weakness, or insubordination. Human life was largely considered expendable in the grand scheme of the wall's creation. Seriously ill or injured workers were typically left to their fate, as medical attention was minimal or non-existent for the common laborer. The psychological impact of such constant oppression, the unending threat of punishment, and the sheer hopelessness of their plight must have been as devastating as the physical toil they endured. It is due to these appalling realities that the Great Wall acquired its most somber and arguably most fitting epithet, the longest cemetery in the world. Though exact figures are unattainable, historical estimates suggest that hundreds of thousands, potentially more than 1 million, Workers died throughout its centuries of construction under various dynasties. The sheer volume of death was catastrophic. The bodies of these unfortunate laborers were often disposed of with chilling practicality. Many were reportedly buried within the wall's foundations or in unmarked mass graves dug nearby. Their remains became an integral, albeit invisible, part of the structure they were forced to build. Folklore and songs lament this, speaking of bones mixed into the mortar, transforming the wall into a literal rampart of human sacrifice. Therefore, when we contemplate the Great Wall's imposing silhouette and its celebrated place in history, it is crucial to also remember the forgotten millions. Their collective ordeal forms an unspoken, tragic counter-narrative to its grandeur, a story etched in every stone. The magnificent structure we admire was built upon their unceasing pain, their families' sorrow, and their nameless graves. This was more than an engineering marvel, it was a human catastrophe of immense proportions. So the next time an image of this iconic landmark appears, try to peer beyond its physical scale and imperial tales. Listen intently, and perhaps you'll sense the sorrowful echoes of those whose lives were consumed by its creation, a stark reminder that the grandest achievements can bear the heaviest human cost. This was their reality, and why it truly sucked. The Great Wall of China, as we often imagine it, a single continuous rampart, didn't spring into existence overnight. Its origins are far older and more fragmented than many realize, stretching back centuries before the first emperor even conceived of a unified Chinese state. Long before a Great Wall, there were simply walls, many of them, built by different kingdoms for different, more localized purposes. These early fortifications were the humble seeds from which one of the world's most monumental construction projects would eventually grow. Understanding these preliminary efforts is key to grasping the sheer audacity and transformative nature of what would later become the Great Wall we recognize today. During the Spring and Autumn and Warring States periods, roughly from the 8th century BCE to 221 BCE, the land we now call China was a patchwork of rival states. These states, constantly vying for supremacy, frequently engaged in warfare to protect their territories, their capitals, and their people from each other as much as from external threats. Many rulers ordered the construction of defensive barriers. These were typically made of rammed earth or mud bricks, following natural contours of the land where possible. They were regional, often disconnected, and varied greatly in scale and effectiveness, reflecting the resources and immediate needs of the state that built them. The Warring States period in particular was an era of intense and unceasing conflict. 7 major states, Qin, Chu, Qi, Yan, Han, Zhao, and Wei, battled relentlessly for dominance. This prolonged period of strife spurred significant developments in military strategy and technology, including siege warfare and sophisticated defensive fortifications. Walls became crucial elements in a state's ability to survive and project power. They were lines drawn in the earth, tangible assertions of sovereignty and a grim necessity in a landscape defined by aggression and the constant threat of invasion from ambitious neighbors. The very air hummed with a tension that demanded strong defenses. As warfare evolved, so too did the design and purpose of these early walls. They weren't just passive barriers. Some incorporated watchtowers for early warning, signaling systems using smoke or fire, and strategically placed gates to control movement or launch counterattacks. States located along the northern frontiers, such as Yan, Zhao, and later Qin, also built walls to defend against nomadic peoples from the steppes. These northern walls were a precursor to the later Great Wall's primary defensive alignment, facing a different kind of threat: swift, horse-mounted raiders rather than the organized armies of competing Chinese states. Each wall told a story of fear, ambition, and ingenuity. Out of this crucible of conflict, one state gradually rose to preeminence, the state of Qin. Located in the western part of the Chinese world, Qin was initially considered somewhat rugged and less cultured by its eastern rivals. However, through a series of sweeping legal, economic, and military reforms, particularly those attributed to Shangeng, which emphasized strict laws and agricultural output, Qin transformed itself into a formidable military power. Its armies were disciplined, its bureaucracy efficient, and its rulers possessed an unyielding ambition to conquer all other states and unify China under their singular rule. An ambition that would reshape the destiny of millions. This ambition culminated in the reign of Yingzheng, who ascended the Qin throne as a young boy. By 221 BCE, after a series of brutal military campaigns, he had vanquished all his rivals and achieved what no one before him had: the complete unification of China. He proclaimed himself Xing Shuwang, the first sovereign emperor. His reign was characterized by monumental undertakings, the standardization of writing, currency, weights, and measures, and also by an autocratic, often brutal exercise of power. He was a visionary, certainly, but also a despot, whose grand designs would be realized through the suffering of his people, a pattern set early in his imperial rule. With the internal warring states subdued, Qin Shi Huang turned his attention to external threats, particularly from the north. The most significant of these were the Xiongnu, a confederation of nomadic tribes inhabiting the vast Mongolian steppes. The Xiongnu were skilled horsemen and archers, capable of launching swift, devastating raids into settled agricultural lands for plunder. Their mobility and hit-and-run tactics made them a persistent and difficult enemy for the sedentary Chinese civilization to counter effectively. They represented a constant source of instability along the northern frontier, a volatile danger that the new empire could not ignore if it wished to maintain its integrity. While some northern states, like Yan, Zhao, and Qin itself, had previously erected defensive walls against these nomadic incursions, these structures were often disconnected, of varying quality, and not part of a unified defensive strategy. They formed a piecemeal barrier at best. For Qin Shi Huang, who envisioned a secure and centralized empire, these fragmented defenses were inadequate. He needed something far grander, a continuous line of defense that would not only protect his newly unified realm, but also clearly demarcate its borders and project the indomitable power of the Qin dynasty to all, both within and beyond its frontiers. Thus, the first emperor conceived of a truly audacious plan to connect, reinforce, and extend these existing northern walls into a single, massive, unified defensive system, the first iteration of what we now call the Great Wall. This was not merely a repair job, it was a colossal undertaking that would require unimaginable resources and manpower. His vision was for an almost unbroken barrier stretching for thousands of miles, a man-made mountain range designed to seal off the northern frontier and provide a bulwark against the Xiongnu horsemen. It was a project born of strategic necessity, imperial ambition, and an almost megalomaniacal drive. This envisioned wall was to be more than just a military fortification. It was also intended as a potent symbol of the newly unified China. Just as he had standardized currency and script to unify the diverse cultures of the former warring states, the wall would be a physical manifestation of this unity. One empire, one frontier, one defense under one emperor. It was meant to define the civilized world of agricultural China against the barbarian nomadic lands. Its construction would also serve to consolidate imperial control by engaging vast numbers of people in a state-directed project, a common purpose dictated from the very top of the power structure. To undertake such a monumental project, Qin Shi Huang wielded absolute power underpinned by the philosophy of legalism. Legalism, which had been instrumental in Qin's rise, emphasized strict adherence to laws, harsh punishments to ensure compliance, and the supreme authority of the ruler. The emperor was seen as the ultimate source of law and order, and his decrees were unchallengeable. This centralized authority, free from the constraints of a powerful nobility or independent regional lords that had characterized earlier periods, gave him unparalleled control over the state's resources, both material and human. His word was, quite literally, law. This absolute power enabled Qin Shi Huang to mobilize the entire machinery of his empire for the wall's construction. He commanded hundreds of thousands, some estimates suggest over 1 million, individuals to work on this colossal project. This workforce was composed of soldiers, convicted criminals, and, crucially, vast numbers of conscripted peasants. These laborers were forcibly moved from their homes across the empire and sent to the harsh, remote northern frontier. Materials, including stone, earth, and wood, had to be quarried, transported, often over vast distances and difficult terrain, and assembled according to the plans laid out by imperial engineers. The imperial decree to build the wall was a command that reverberated throughout the newly unified empire, bringing with it a wave of dread. For the common people, particularly the peasants who formed the bulk of the conscripted labor, such a summons often amounted to a death sentence. They were to leave their families, their farms, and their lives behind, to toil in harsh conditions under brutal overseers, with little hope of ever returning. This mobilization, while showcasing the emperor's power, also laid the foundation for immense suffering and resentment, a dark undercurrent to his grand achievements that would have lasting repercussions. While this chapter focuses on the origins and imperial vision behind the wall, it's impossible to discuss its inception without acknowledging the immense human cost that was inherent in Qin Shi Huang's command. The decision to build such a structure, using the methods available at the time, was also a decision to sacrifice countless lives. The story of the Great Wall's construction is inextricably linked to the suffering of its builders, a theme central to our exploration. The first emperor's ambition cast a long, dark shadow, and the foundations of his wall were laid not just with stone and earth, but with the very lives of his subjects, a bitter truth we will delve into. Beyond its primary defensive role against the Xiongnu, Qin Shi Huang's Great Wall was envisioned with other functions in mind. It was to serve as a means of border control, regulating the movement of people and preventing unauthorized passage in or out of the empire. It could also facilitate trade by funneling merchants through designated fortified passes where duties could be levied. The system of watchtowers, integral to the wall, also formed an advanced communication network, capable of relaying messages about enemy movements or other important news quickly across vast distances using smoke signals by day and fire by night, ensuring a swifter imperial response. In essence, the genesis of the Great Wall under Qin Shi Huang was a confluence of critical factors: the long history of wall building by earlier states, the pressing need for a unified defense against the persistent Xiongnu threat following China's unification, and crucially, the first emperor's absolute, unchallengeable power. This power, rooted in legalist philosophy and a centralized state, allowed him to dream on an unprecedented scale and to mobilize the nation's resources to transform that dream into a stark, imposing reality. The wall was thus born of strategic necessity, imperial ambition, and the will of a single, all-powerful ruler, setting the stage for one of history's most arduous and tragic construction sagas. When we gaze upon the Great Wall or images of its immense scale, our thoughts often turn to the engineering marvel, the strategic vision. But tonight, we shift our focus from the stones and earth to the hands that moved them, the backs that bore them. Who were these individuals, the unnamed millions whose toil and suffering are embedded in every mile of this colossal structure? The answer is not a tale of willing volunteers or patriotic fervor, but one of coercion, punishment, and inescapable duty. The wall rose on the efforts of a vast, unwilling army of laborers, a truth that is fundamental to understanding its grim legacy. It's crucial to grasp from the outset that participation in the Great Wall's construction, particularly during its early, formative phases like the Qin dynasty, was overwhelmingly non-voluntary. This was not a public works project that people eagerly joined for wages or glory. Instead, it was a brutal system of forced labor, a corvée imposed by an autocratic state. For those condemned to the wall, it was often a life sentence to hardship, a place where hope dwindled with each passing day under the relentless sun or freezing winds. Their presence there was a testament not to their loyalty, but to the emperor's absolute power to command and consume human life. The largest single group compelled to work on the Great Wall consisted of conscripted peasants. These were ordinary farmers, the backbone of China's agricultural society, plucked from their villages and fields by imperial decree. Under systems like the corvée labor laws, able-bodied men were required to provide a certain amount of unpaid labor to the state each year. Building the Great Wall became one of the most dreaded forms of this service. These men were not criminals or soldiers by trade. They were fathers, sons, and husbands whose primary skill was tilling the land, not hauling massive stones across treacherous mountain terrain. For peasant families, the conscription of their men was a devastating blow. It meant the loss of essential labor for planting and harvesting crops, often leading to severe economic hardship and even starvation for those left behind. The journey to the remote northern frontiers where the wall was being built was long and perilous, and many perished before even reaching the construction sites. There was no choice in the matter. Refusal or evasion would bring swift and severe punishment not only upon the individual, but often upon their entire family as well. The state's demand for labor was inexorable, overriding all personal and communal needs. Once at the wall, these peasant conscripts faced conditions far removed from their agrarian lives. They were ill-equipped for the harsh climate and the brutal physical demands of construction. Supervised by unforgiving overseers and often working alongside hardened criminals, their existence was one of constant toil, hunger, and fear. Many folk songs and legends from later periods lament the fate of these peasant builders, dragged from their homes to die in distant, desolate lands, their bodies sometimes rumored to be interred within the wall itself. Their contribution was immense, their suffering equally so, a silent testament to the cost of empire. Another significant portion of the wall's workforce comprised convicted criminals. Throughout various dynasties, sentencing offenders to labor on the Great Wall became a common form of punishment. The crimes that could lead to such a fate ranged widely, from petty theft and tax evasion to more serious offenses like rebellion or murder. For many, being sent to the wall was effectively a death sentence, albeit a slow and agonizing one. The state saw this as a convenient way to rid society of undesirable elements while simultaneously providing a seemingly inexhaustible supply of free, expendable labor for its most demanding projects. Convict laborers often endured the harshest conditions and the most brutal treatment. They were frequently shackled or wore distinctive clothing that marked their lowly status, setting them apart for abuse. Survival rates among these groups were notoriously low. They were assigned the most dangerous tasks, given the poorest rations, and subjected to the relentless cruelty of guards who saw them as less than human. The Wall, for these condemned men and women, was a vast penal colony, a remote and unforgiving frontier where justice was harsh and mercy was a forgotten word. Their lives were measured in the amount of stone they could move before they collapsed. The nature of penal labor on the Wall varied. Some convicts were sentenced for fixed terms, while others faced indefinite servitude, their release dependent on imperial whim or their ability to survive years of back-breaking toil. In some periods, even minor offenses could result in years of labor in these harsh northern territories. The system was designed to be a powerful deterrent, showcasing the state's intolerance for lawlessness. However, its practical effect was to create a constantly replenished pool of workers who had nothing to lose, driven by desperation and overseen by a regime that valued their labor far more than their lives. Soldiers also formed a critical component of the Great Wall's construction crews, especially during periods of active expansion or conflict. Large garrisons were stationed along the frontier not only to defend against external threats like the Xiongnu, but also to participate directly in the building and repair of the fortifications. For the common soldier, life on the Wall was one of unrelenting hardship. They faced the dangers of enemy raids, the grueling physical labor of construction, and the same harsh environmental conditions as other workers, often for years on end, far from their homes and families. The dual burden of military duty and construction labor placed immense strain on the soldiers. They were expected to be ready to fight at a moment's notice while also quarrying stone, transporting materials, and erecting ramparts. Discipline was by necessity incredibly strict. This system, while providing a large and relatively organized workforce, also meant that the empire's military strength was sometimes tied up in massive building projects rather than being solely focused on defense or expansionary campaigns. For the individual soldier, it was a life of constant vigilance and exhausting labor under the watchful eyes of their commanders. In the aftermath of military campaigns and the suppression of rebellions, prisoners of war and captured enemies often found themselves condemned to labor on the Great Wall. These individuals were treated as spoils of war, their lives and labor forfeited to the victorious state. Their numbers could swell significantly after major battles, providing a sudden influx of manpower for the relentless construction efforts. For these captives, forced labor on the Wall was a bitter extension of their defeat, a constant reminder of their subjugation and a physically brutal experience in an alien and hostile environment far from their homelands. The treatment of these captive laborers was typically even worse than that of the regular convict population. They were often seen as inherently disloyal and dangerous, subject to extreme brutality with no recourse or hope of reprieve. Language barriers could exacerbate their suffering, making it difficult to understand commands or plead for mercy. As a disposable workforce, they were assigned the most perilous tasks with minimal regard for their safety or well-being. Their unrecorded deaths contributed to the Wall's grim reputation as the longest cemetery, their identities lost to history, their suffering absorbed into the vastness of the project. A smaller but notable group forced to contribute to the Wall's construction or to endure hardship in its shadow included disgraced officials and scholars. In the highly centralized and often politically volatile imperial Chinese system, falling out of favor with the emperor or losing a power struggle could result in severe punishment, including exile to the remote and inhospitable frontier regions where the Wall was located. While they might not always have been forced into the same backbreaking physical labor as peasants or convicts, their exile was a form of condemnation, stripping them of status, comfort, and intellectual pursuits. For these educated individuals accustomed to lives of privilege, influence, or scholarly contemplation in the bustling urban centers of the empire, exile to the desolate Wall regions was a profound humiliation and a severe hardship. Some were tasked with supervisory roles or clerical duties related to the construction, while others might simply be forced to endure the harsh conditions as a form of punishment. Their presence underscored the emperor's absolute power to elevate and cast down, serving as a warning to others in positions of authority. The frontier was a place where careers, reputations, and lives could easily end. Across all these diverse groups, peasant conscripts, convicted criminals, soldiers, prisoners of war, and exiled elites, the common denominator was the utter lack of choice. They were cogs in a vast imperial machine, their lives dictated by the state's insatiable demand for labor to realize its monumental ambitions. Duty was not requested, it was commanded. Penalties for shirking this duty, attempting to escape, or even failing to meet work quotas were exceptionally severe, often involving brutal physical punishment, extended sentences, or summary execution. The entire system was built upon a foundation of coercion and fear, ensuring a steady supply of hands Therefore, when we speak of who built the Great Wall, it is essential to remember these faces in the shadows. The farmer forced to abandon his plow, the criminal paying a terrible price for his transgressions, the soldier serving under harsh command, the captive stripped of his freedom, and the scholar banished from grace. It was their collective, unwilling, and often unrecorded sacrifice that raised this wonder of the world. The Great Wall of China stands not only as a testament to engineering prowess, but also as a somber monument to the staggering extent of forced human endeavor, a stark reminder of what it truly sucked to be one of its builders. The path of the Great Wall of China, snaking across thousands of miles, was dictated not by convenience, but by the harsh realities of imperial defense. It clung to mountain ridges, plunged into deep gorges, and stretched across barren deserts, all to secure the empire's northern frontier. This strategic imperative, however, meant that the men tasked with its construction were thrust into some of the most inhospitable environments imaginable. Tonight we explore how the very land upon which the wall was raised became a relentless, formidable adversary to those who toiled there, a silent enemy that claimed countless lives. Imagine the sheer variety of this immense construction site. It wasn't a flat, predictable plain. Instead, it was a canvas of extremes, a tapestry woven with towering peaks, shifting sands, and dense, remote wilderness. For the workers, this meant that every day was not just a battle against the immense task of building, but also a battle against the elements and the earth itself. The landscape was not a passive backdrop, it was an active agent of their suffering, shaping their ordeal and often sealing their fate. The very ground beneath their feet could be as dangerous as any human foe they were meant to guard against. In the north and northeast, significant portions of the wall were constructed along the precipitous crests of mountain ranges. Picture jagged peaks piercing the sky, slopes so steep that a single misstep could send a worker tumbling hundreds, if not thousands of feet into rocky ravines below. There were no safety harnesses, no modern climbing gear. Men laden with heavy stones or baskets of earth had to navigate narrow, treacherous paths, often slick with ice in winter or loose scree in summer. The mountains demanded not just strength, but an agility that exhaustion and malnutrition quickly eroded. Building on such mountainous terrain presented unique and deadly challenges. Quarrying stone from sheer cliff faces was perilous, and transporting these massive blocks to the construction line, often uphill, was a Herculean task. Landslides, triggered by excavation or natural instability, were a constant threat, capable of burying work crews in an instant. Furthermore, the higher altitudes in many mountainous sections meant thinner air, making every physical exertion even more taxing, particularly for those already weakened by poor diet and relentless labor. The mountains were majestic, but for the workers, they were a vertical, unforgiving prison. The climate in these northern mountain ranges was as brutal as the topography. Winters were long and intensely cold, with temperatures frequently plummeting far below freezing. Biting winds, funneled through mountain passes, whipped at the workers, chilling them to the bone. Frostbite was rampant, leading to the loss of fingers, toes, and sometimes limbs. Snow and ice made the already dangerous footing even more precarious and often halted construction, though the demand for progress from imperial overseers rarely ceased. Shelter was rudimentary at best, offering little protection from the pervasive, life-saping cold. To the west, particularly sections of the wall that stretched towards the Gobi Desert, the environment presented a starkly different, yet equally lethal, set of challenges. Here the workers contended with vast, arid expanses, a seemingly endless sea of sand and gravel under a merciless sky. During the day, especially in summer, temperatures could soar to unbearable highs, the sun beating down relentlessly, reflecting off the pale ground to bake the men from above and below. Heat stroke, severe dehydration, and sunblindness were common afflictions in these desolate, sun-scorched wastelands. The desert, however, was a land of brutal extremes. While days were scorching, nights could bring a shocking, plummeting cold, leaving thinly clad workers shivering uncontrollably. Water, the most basic necessity, was incredibly scarce, often having to be transported over vast distances at great effort, and its lack was a constant torment. Furthermore, the landscape itself was unstable. Fierce sandstorms could arise with little warning, engulfing entire work sites, blinding the laborers, choking their lungs, and burying their meager tools and supplies. Building on shifting sands also posed immense engineering difficulties. In these arid western regions, the very materials needed for construction were often hard to come by. Unlike the forested mountains where timber might be found, or rocky areas providing stone, the desert offered little. Local earth, when used for ramp sections, had to be carefully selected and compacted. Every resource, from food and water for the workers to the reeds and tamarisk branches sometimes used in desert wall construction, was precious, and often had to be sourced from afar. This scarcity amplified the logistical challenges and the suffering of the workforce, who often went without. Many segments of the Great Wall were deliberately routed through extremely remote and desolate locations, far from established towns, villages, or even basic trade routes. This isolation was a strategic choice, meant to create a formidable barrier in sparsely populated areas, but it had dire consequences for the workforce. Supply lines for food, water, tools, and medical aid were stretched thin, often breaking down entirely. Workers in these isolated outposts were truly on their own, cut off from the outside world and any hope of relief or timely assistance. This remoteness was a heavy psychological burden. The profound isolation took a heavy psychological toll on the workers, many of whom were already demoralized by forced labor and brutal conditions. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, with no change in scenery beyond the relentless construction and the indifferent, empty horizon. The absence of news from home, the lack of any social interaction beyond their fellow sufferers and harsh overseers, and the sheer monotony of their existence could lead to despair, madness, or a complete breakdown of will. In these vast solitudes, the spirit could be crushed just as effectively as the body, a slow erosion of hope. The climate across the wall's vast expanse acted as a constant, formidable adversary, its seasonal cycles bringing different forms of misery. Brutal winters, as we've seen, brought snow, ice, and lethal cold. Spring thaws could trigger floods and landslides, undoing previous work and creating new hazards. Sweltering summers, whether the humid heat of the eastern sections or the dry, oven-like conditions of the western deserts, led to exhaustion, dehydration, and sunstroke. Autumn might offer a brief respite, but it was always overshadowed by the knowledge of the approaching winter and the unending labor. These extreme climatic conditions had a direct and devastating impact on the health of the workforce. Frostbite and hypothermia were common killers in winter. In summer, heat exhaustion and dehydration claimed many lives. Respiratory illnesses, exacerbated by dust, cold, and poor living conditions, were rampant. Infectious diseases could also spread rapidly through weakened and malnourished populations housed in crowded, unsanitary camps. The climate wasn't just uncomfortable, it was an active agent of disease and death, preying on bodies already pushed to their limits by unceasing toil and deprivation. Despite the dangers posed by extreme weather, the pressure from imperial authorities and their overseers to continue construction rarely let up. Quotas had to be met and schedules adhered to, regardless of blizzards, heat waves, or torrential rain. Workers might be forced to labor in conditions that courted disaster, their overseers valuing progress on the wall far more than the lives of the men building it. This relentless drive in defiance of the natural elements meant that the workers were often caught between the cruelty of their masters and the unforgiving wrath of nature, a truly impossible situation. Beyond the overarching challenges of mountains, deserts, and climate, the wildness of the terrain posed other specific dangers. In forested or remote mountainous areas, workers could encounter dangerous wildlife, wolves, leopards, or bears, especially when isolated or foraging for food. Venomous snakes and scorpions were a threat in warmer regions. Flash floods, particularly in narrow gorges or desert wadis after sudden downpours, could sweep away encampments and workers with terrifying speed. The very earth could be treacherous, with unseen sinkholes or unstable cliff edges giving way without warning. The diverse and often unstable ground itself presented enormous engineering challenges, which translated into increased danger and toil for the workers. Building stable foundations for heavy stone walls on loose sand, marshy ground, or steep eroding slopes required immense effort and often involved primitive, hazardous techniques. Securing footing for watchtowers on narrow mountain crests was a feat of daring and desperation. Every section of the wall had its own unique geological personality, and each presented new ways for the terrain to resist its construction and endanger its builders. The earth fought back. In conclusion, the terrain through which the Great Wall of China was built was far more than a passive stage for this grand historical drama. It was an active, relentless antagonist, a formidable weapon that worked in concert with human cruelty to inflict unimaginable suffering upon the workforce. The mountains, deserts, and unforgiving climates were not mere obstacles. They were instruments of torture and death. The wall, a scar carved across the face of China, was built by men whose lives were scarred, and often extinguished, by the very land they were forced to conquer for the glory of an emperor, making their ordeal truly, deeply suck. The Great Wall of China stands as a testament to what human endeavor can achieve. Yet when we marvel at its scale, it's crucial to strip away any modern notions of construction. There were no excavators, no cranes, no power tools. The monumental task of raising this colossal barrier rested almost entirely on the raw power of human and animal muscle. Aided by only the most rudimentary of implements, tonight we delve into the world of primitive tools and the backbreaking labor they demanded, painting a picture of how stone, earth, and, far too often, human blood were painstakingly transformed into the Great Wall. Imagine a construction site stretching for thousands of miles, teeming with hundreds of thousands of workers, yet almost silent of the sounds of machinery we associate with building today. The dominant sounds would have been the chipping of stone, the thud of earth being tamped, the creak of wooden levers, the grunts and shouts of men straining at their limits, and the ceaseless shuffle of feet carrying unbearable load. Every stone moved, every basket of earth lifted, every rampart raised was a direct consequence of exhausting manual effort, repeated millions upon millions of times. This was building in its most primal, most brutal form. The tools available to the Great Wall's builders were shockingly simple, often crude by any standard, let alone for a project of such magnitude. The primary implements for working with stone were iron hammers of various sizes, chisels, and wedges. For digging and moving earth, workers relied on basic iron-tipped spades, wooden shovels, and picks. These tools were often locally forged, variable in quality, and wore down quickly under the relentless strain, needing constant repair or replacement. Owning or being issued a slightly better tool could mean a marginal easing of an otherwise impossible burden. For transporting materials, the most common items were woven baskets made from reeds or bamboo. These would be filled with earth, small stones, or bricks, and then carried by hand on shoulder poles balanced by one or two men, or sometimes strapped to a worker's back. For slightly larger loads, or where terrain permitted, crude wooden wheelbarrows or handcarts might be employed, though their effectiveness was severely limited on steep slopes or uneven ground. These simple carrying aids did little to alleviate the crushing weight, only transferring it to already aching muscles and joints. Quarrying the vast quantities of stone needed for the wall was an agonizingly slow and dangerous process. Without explosives, workers had to rely on sheer brute force and basic physics. One common method involved driving iron or wooden wedges into natural cracks in the rock face. These wedges were then hammered relentlessly into the stone split. Another technique was to heat a section of rock with fire, then rapidly cool it with water, causing it to fracture. Both methods were labor-intensive, inefficient, and exposed workers to the dangers of flying rock splinters and collapsing rock faces. Consider the immense physical effort involved in this quarrying. Hour after hour, day after day, men would swing heavy hammers, their bodies slick with sweat, their muscles screaming in protest. The jarring impact of hammer on chisel or wedge would send shockwaves through their arms and shoulders. Dust from the stone would fill their lungs. Progress was measured in inches, not feet. And once a block was finally wrested from the mountainside, the even more daunting task of moving its dead weight, often many tons, to the construction line began. This initial stage alone was enough to break the strongest of men. Once quarried, stones often needed to be roughly shaped to fit into the wall. This was done with hammers and chisels, a slow process of chipping away at the rock to achieve a somewhat regular form. There was little precision. The emphasis was on creating blocks that could be stacked. In some regions and dynasties, particularly the Ming, bricks were extensively used. This involved mining clay, mixing it, molding it into bricks, and then firing them in vast kilns. While bricks offered more uniformity, their production was another highly labor-intensive process, consuming huge amounts of fuel and manpower. The transportation of these materials, massive stones, countless bricks, and an almost unimaginable volume of earth, was perhaps the most visibly grueling aspect of the wall's construction. Human chains were often formed, with workers passing baskets of earth or smaller stones from one person to the next, especially up steep slopes. For heavier stones, teams of men would strain together, using ropes made of hemp or bamboo and sheer muscle power to drag, push, or carry the loads. So every foot gained was a victory, hard won against gravity and exhaustion. Much of the Great Wall snakes along high mountain ridges. This meant that the vast majority of materials had to be moved uphill, a task that amplified the agony exponentially. Workers would claw their way up precipitous inclines, laden with back-breaking weights. Simple ramps of earth or timber were constructed, and logs were sometimes used as rollers beneath the heaviest stones, but these offered only marginal assistance on severe gradients. The sight of hundreds of men inching a single massive stone up a mountainside, their bodies contorted with effort, must have been a vision of human suffering on an epic scale. Where possible, primitive lifting devices like levers and gin wheels, a type of simple crane powered by men or animals, might have been employed for some of the heavier stones, particularly for watchtower construction. Animals such as oxen, mules, and donkeys were also used to haul materials, but their utility was severely limited in the most rugged and mountainous terrain where much of the wall was built. In these inaccessible areas, it invariably fell to human laborers to bear the brunt of the transport, their bodies serving as the primary machines of burden. In regions where stone was scarce, particularly in the western desert sections, large parts of the wall were built using rammed earth, a technique dating back millennia. This involved constructing timber frames or shuttering to create a mold for a section of the wall. Earth, often carefully selected for its clay content, was then poured into the frame in thin layers. Each layer, typically only a few inches deep, had to be meticulously compacted by pounding it with heavy wooden or stone rammers. This was monotonous, repetitive, and physically punishing work, often carried out under a blazing sun. The process of tamping the earth was crucial for achieving the necessary density and strength for the rammed earth walls. Teams of workers, often chanting rhythmically to coordinate their efforts, would lift and drop heavy rammers for hours on end. The constant jarring impact, the dust, and the sheer mind-numbing tedium of compacting layer upon layer of earth, foot by foot, mile after mile, made this a particularly soul-destroying task. Yet the durability of some of these ancient rammed earth sections, still standing today, is a testament to the thoroughness of this exhausting labor. Whether working with stone or rammed earth, laying the foundations and gradually raising the height of the wall was a slow, painstaking process. For stone walls, laborers had to carefully position and fit, often irregular blocks, using smaller stones and mortar made from lime or sticky rice, in later dynasties, to fill the gaps. Building stable foundations on uneven or treacherous ground required immense care and effort. Each course of stone represented countless hours of quarrying, transporting, and lifting, a visible accumulation of human exertion rising slowly against the horizon. But it's important to remember the absence of the precision tools we take for granted today. While Chinese engineers were skilled in surveying and layout, the individual workers had little more than their eyes and rudimentary guides to ensure stones were laid correctly or earth was tamped evenly. The sheer scale of the project meant that minor inaccuracies were inevitable, yet the overall structure had to be sound. The constant struggle to achieve stability and strength with such basic means, under such pressure, added another layer of difficulty to the workers' already overwhelming tasks. Ultimately, the primary machine on the Great Wall construction site was the human body itself. It was human arms that swung hammers, human legs that climbed mountains under load, human backs that bent and strained to lift and carry. This relentless physical output, often fueled by inadequate nutrition and rest, took a terrible toll. Exhaustion was a constant state. Injuries were frequent. Crushed fingers and toes, strained muscles, broken bones from falls or shifting load. Chronic pain was an accepted part of daily existence for these forgotten builders. The chapter titled Stone, Earth, and Blood encapsulates the grim reality. The stone and earth were the materials of the wall, but blood was the price of their assembly with such primitive tools. Every cut from a chisel, every abrasion from a rough stone, every internal injury from overexertion contributed to this cost. The monumental task of creating the Great Wall was achieved not through technological sophistication, but through an almost unimaginable expenditure of human effort and endurance. It truly, deeply sucked to be a cog in this vast, agonizing machine, armed with little more than your own failing strength against the unforgiving materials of an emperor's ambition. The construction of the Great Wall demanded an almost superhuman expenditure of energy from its workforce. Day after day, month after month, year after year, hundreds of thousands of men engaged in the most arduous physical labor imaginable. Yet the fuel provided for this immense human engine was often tragic, catastrophically inadequate. Tonight we delve into the meager sustenance offered to the wall's builders, examining how their diet, far from sustaining them, became a slow, insidious path to weakness, disease, and ultimately, for so many, death. It was in many ways a recipe for disaster, served daily. The story of food, or the lack thereof, on the Great Wall is more than just a tale of empty stomachs. It's a critical factor that compounded every other hardship these workers faced. A body starved of essential nutrients cannot effectively combat the freezing cold or scorching heat. It cannot efficiently repair muscles torn by exertion, nor can it mount a robust defense against ever-present pathogens. The diet of a Great Wall worker was a constant gnawing reminder of their expendability, a clear indication that their strength and lives were being consumed far faster than they could ever be replenished. Sustenance was a cruel illusion. The cornerstone of the worker's diet, when it was available, was grain. Depending on the region and the era, this typically meant millet in the north or rice and wheat in other areas. This was usually provided in its most basic form, perhaps boiled into a thin, watery congee or gruel, or ground into coarse flour to make unleavened, often gritty bread or steamed buns. While grains provided carbohydrates for some energy, they offered little else in terms of balanced nutrition. The sheer monotony of this diet, meal after meal, day after day, must also have been a significant psychological burden, a joyless necessity. Even the quantity of these staple grains was often insufficient. Official ration amounts might have been set, but the reality on the remote construction sites could be vastly different. Corruption among officials, logistical difficulties in supply, and spoilage could all reduce the actual amount of food reaching the workers' bowls. Furthermore, the quality of the grain itself was often poor. It might be old, infested with insects, or mixed with cheaper, less nutritious fillers. This meant that even when workers received their allotted ration, its true caloric and nutritional value could be severely compromised. A glaring deficiency in the Great Wall workers' diet was the almost complete absence of adequate protein. Meat, whether from domesticated animals or hunted game, would have been an extreme rarity, likely reserved for military officers or high-ranking supervisors. Fish might have been available in some riverine areas, but preserving and transporting it to remote work sites was a challenge. Even plant-based proteins, such as beans or lentils, which were common in peasant diets elsewhere, appear to have been supplied inconsistently, if at all, in the rations for wall laborers. This protein scarcity had dire consequences. Equally devastating was the chronic lack of fresh fruits and vegetables. These vital sources of vitamins and minerals were virtually unobtainable for most workers on the desolate frontiers. The logistical effort focused on transporting bulk grains, not perishable produce. This meant that the laborers' bodies were starved of essential micronutrients crucial for countless bodily functions, including immune response, tissue repair, and energy metabolism. Conditions like scurvy, resulting from vitamin C deficiency, or beriberi from vitamin B1 thiamine deficiency, would have thrived in such dietary deserts. The physical labor involved in quarrying stone, hauling materials, and constructing the wall was incredibly demanding, requiring thousands of calories per day simply to maintain body weight and function. The meager, predominantly grain-based diet seldom, if ever, met these energy requirements. Workers were trapped in a perpetual caloric deficit, meaning their bodies were forced to consume their own muscle and fat reserves to survive. This led to progressive emaciation, a constant state of gnawing hunger, and a debilitating lack of energy for the tasks at hand. Each day they became a little weaker. This chronic energy shortage translated directly into profound exhaustion. It wasn't just the tiredness one feels after a hard day's work, it was a deep, bone-wearying fatigue that no amount of rest could truly alleviate, especially when coupled with insufficient sleep and harsh conditions. Every swing of a hammer, every step taken under a heavy load became an immense effort. Concentration faltered, increasing the risk of accidents. This pervasive exhaustion, fueled by persistent hunger, made the already brutal work an almost unimaginable torment, a daily struggle against the body's desperate cries for sustenance. The physical manifestations of severe malnutrition would have been starkly visible among the workforce. Emaciated frames with ribs clearly showing, distended bellies due to edema from protein deficiency, kwashiorkor, and skin that was dry, flaky, and prone to sores and infections. Hair might become brittle and lose its pigment. Wounds would heal slowly, if at all. Eyes might appear dull and sunken. These weren't just signs of hunger. They were the outward expressions of bodies breaking down, starved of the fundamental building blocks needed to sustain life under such duress. It was a slow, visible decay. Beyond the visible signs, malnutrition induced a profound lethargy. The will to work, the will to live, could be sapped by the constant lack of energy and the overwhelming feeling of physical weakness. Mentally, concentration and cognitive function would also be impaired. Crucially, the immune system, starved of necessary proteins, vitamins, and minerals, would become severely compromised. This left the workers incredibly vulnerable to any infections or diseases that were inevitably present in the often unsanitary and overcrowded conditions of the labor camps. Their bodies had little defense left. A weakened immune system turned common illnesses into potential death sentences. Respiratory infections like pneumonia or bronchitis, gastrointestinal ailments leading to diarrhea and further dehydration, and skin infections could rapidly overwhelm a malnourished body. Contagious diseases such as dysentery or typhoid likely spread like wildfire through the work camps, where sanitation was rudimentary and personal hygiene difficult to maintain. Malnutrition didn't just make workers sick, it made them far more likely to die from those sicknesses. creating a vicious cycle of weakness and disease. The interconnectedness of poor diet, intense labor, and harsh conditions created a cascade of physical failure. A worker weakened by hunger was more prone to accidents. An injured worker unable to labor effectively might receive even smaller rations, further hastening their decline. A sick worker, lacking the nutritional reserves to fight off illness, would quickly deteriorate. It was a downward spiral from which few could escape once they began to falter. The official indifference to this suffering meant that little was done to interrupt this deadly progression for the majority. The perilous food supply chain also played a critical role. Even if the imperial court decreed adequate rations, the journey of that food to the remote construction sites was long and fraught with peril. Supplies had to be transported vast distances over difficult terrain, susceptible to banditry, animal attacks, or simply spoilage due to weather and lack of proper storage. Officials overseeing the supply chain were often corrupt, siphoning off significant portions of the food for their own profit, leaving even less for the laborers at the end of the line. The workers were the last and least prioritized link in this fragile chain of sustenance. The meager food supply was also vulnerable to external factors. A poor harvest in the agricultural regions supplying the frontier could lead to drastic cuts in rations. Wartime conditions, with armies needing priority provisioning, could divert food away from construction projects. These interruptions, when they occurred, would have had an immediate and devastating impact on the already starving workforce, pushing them further towards the brink of existence. There was no buffer, no surplus to fall back on. The supply was always stretched to its absolute limit, and often beyond. While not food, water was an equally critical component of sustenance, and its availability and quality were often dire. In desert regions, water was scarce and sometimes brackish. In other areas, water sources could be easily contaminated by human and animal waste from the large temporary encampments, leading to widespread waterborne diseases like cholera or dysentery. Dehydration, especially during strenuous labor in hot weather, would have rapidly incapacitated workers, and drinking contaminated water often only exchanged one form of suffering for another, further weakening their fragile hold on life. The diet provided to the Great Wall's builders was more than just insufficient. It was effectively a recipe for weakness, disease, and premature death. The chronic lack of calories, protein, and essential micronutrients ensured that the workers' bodies were constantly breaking down, unable to cope with the brutal labor, the harsh environment, or the pervasive threat of illness. Hunger was their constant companion, a gnawing emptiness that defined their wretched existence. This systematic neglect of the most basic human need for adequate sustenance stands as one of the most damning indictments of why it truly, deeply sucked to be a worker on the Great Wall. The immense physical toil, the brutal terrain, and the gnawing hunger were the visible torments of the Great Wall worker. But alongside these, stalking every camp and every work site were a host of invisible enemies, disease and injury. These silent killers often proved more relentless and indiscriminate than the harshest overseer. Tonight we turn our gaze to the pervasive sicknesses and frequent accidents that made life and death along the wall an even more harrowing ordeal, further cementing its reputation as the world's longest, most tragic cemetery. The very conditions under which the Great Wall was built created a perfect breeding ground for illness and a constant stage for debilitating accidents. Thousands of men, weakened by malnutrition and exhaustion, were crammed together in primitive makeshift encampments, with little to no regard for hygiene or safety. In this environment, a minor ailment could swiftly escalate into a fatal condition, and a simple misstep could lead to a horrific end. For the laborers, there was no escape from these ever-present threats. They were an intrinsic part of their daily, wretched existence along the frontier. Sanitation in the vast labor camps strung along the wall's construction path was, to put it mildly, appalling. There were no organized sewage systems, no proper methods for waste disposal. Human and animal refuse accumulated, contaminating the living areas and, crucially, the local water sources. Flies, rats, and other vermin thrived in these squalid conditions, acting as vectors for a multitude of diseases. The air itself would have been thick with the stench of decay and human waste, a constant reminder of the unhealthy environment these men were forced to inhabit day and night. The sheer density of the workforce, with men living cheek by jowl in poorly ventilated huts or tents, meant that contagious diseases could spread with terrifying rapidity. A single sick worker could quickly infect dozens, and outbreaks could decimate entire work crews. There was no concept of quarantine for the common laborer, no understanding of germ theory. The illness was often attributed to evil spirits or imbalances in bodily humors, but its true roots lay in the filth and crowding that were an accepted, if deadly, part of life on the wall. This proximity bred pestilence. Among the most feared and common ailments were severe intestinal sicknesses, conditions akin to what we now know as dysentery and cholera. These were almost invariably contracted from drinking water contaminated by human feces. Dysentery, with its debilitating abdominal pain, high fever, and bloody diarrhea, would leave a worker utterly prostrated, rapidly leading to severe dehydration and often death, especially in a body already weakened by chronic hunger. The constant need for water, coupled with its perilous state, created a lethal trap. Outbreaks of illnesses resembling cholera, characterized by profuse, watery diarrhea and vomiting, could sweep through camps with devastating speed. Such diseases would drain the life from a victim within hours or days, leading to rapid dehydration, electrolyte imbalance, and circulatory collapse. In an era without intravenous fluids or antibiotics, the mortality rate from these acute gastrointestinal infections would have been extraordinarily high. The sight of fellow workers succumbing so quickly and horribly must have been a terrifying, demoralizing spectacle for those who remained. Other virulent fevers also plagued the work camps. Conditions were ripe for diseases like typhus, often transmitted by body lice, which would have thrived in the unwashed, crowded conditions. Typhus typically presented with high fever, severe headache, a characteristic rash, and delirium. It was highly contagious and often fatal, particularly for those already suffering from malnutrition and exhaustion. The term camp fever, in other historical contexts, often referred to typhus, a scourge of massed groups of people in unsanitary environments, a perfect description of the Great Wall's labor force. Beyond specific identifiable diseases, many workers would have succumbed to a host of other infections and fevers that, without modern diagnostics, would have been simply described as pestilence or the plague. Malaria might have been present in certain regions with stagnant water. Influenza or virulent forms of pneumonia could spread like wildfire, especially during the harsh winter months when workers were huddled together for warmth. Any ailment that brought fever and weakness to an already compromised body was a dire threat to survival on the remote frontier. In the absence of even basic antiseptics or clean wound dressings, any break in the skin could become a gateway for deadly infection. A simple cut from a sharp stone, a blister from a worn tool handle, or an abrasion from a fall could quickly become inflamed, fill with pus, and lead to systemic infection, or what we now call sepsis. Gangrene could set in, particularly in frostbitten limbs, and there were no antibiotics to fight these bacterial invaders, so once an infection took hold, it often progressed inexorably, leading to a painful, lingering death for the unfortunate worker. The construction of the wall, especially along steep mountain ridges and high watchtowers, made falls an ever-present and lethal danger. Workers clambered over precipitous slopes, often carrying heavy loads, with no safety ropes, scaffolding in the modern sense, or protective gear. A moment of dizziness from hunger or heat, a loose rock underfoot, or a sudden gust of wind could send a man plummeting to his death or to a mangled state far below. Such accidents would have been horrifyingly common, a stark reminder of the vertical battlefield these men worked upon daily. The sheer weight of the materials involved in the wall's construction, massive stones, tons of earth, meant that crushing injuries were another frequent hazard. Stones could slip from primitive lifting devices or ropes, fall from partially constructed walls, or shift unexpectedly during transport, crushing limbs or entire bodies. Quarrying operations were inherently dangerous, with the risk of rock falls or premature splitting of boulders. Cave-ins during the excavation of foundations or tunnels for pathways also occurred. These were brutal, often instantly fatal accidents. In the scorching deserts of the West, or during the intense heat of summer months elsewhere along the wall, heat stroke was a swift and silent killer. Laborers toiled relentlessly under a blazing sun, often with insufficient water and no shade. The body's ability to regulate its temperature would be overwhelmed, leading to confusion, collapse, organ failure, and death. Those who succumbed to heat stroke likely died quickly, their bodies unable to cope with the dual assault of extreme heat and extreme exertion, particularly when already dehydrated and malnourished. Conversely, the brutal winters of northern China and the high mountain ranges brought the perils of frostbite and hypothermia. Workers, often inadequately clothed and sheltered, exposed to sub-zero temperatures and biting winds for months on end, suffered terribly. Frostbite would blacken fingers, toes, ears, and noses, leading to agonizing pain and often necessitating crude amputations, if the victim even survived. Prolonged exposure to cold would lead to hypothermia, a gradual shutting down of the body's functions, ending in a quiet, frozen death. Faced with this onslaught of disease and injury, what medical care could a common Great Wall worker expect? The grim answer is virtually none. While imperial officials or skilled artisans might have had access to physicians trained in traditional Chinese medicine, such care was a distant dream for the peasant conscript or convict laborer. There were no field hospitals, no organized medical corps dedicated to the well-being of the rank-and-file workers. They were in essence left to fend for themselves or die. Any available care was primitive at best. If a worker fell ill or was injured, they might resort to folk remedies learned in their villages, or perhaps a fellow worker might know some basic herbal treatments. However, such measures were utterly inadequate against severe trauma, rampant infections, or epidemic diseases like dysentery or typhus. Without an understanding of infection control, sterile procedures, or effective medicines for these conditions, traditional healing practices could offer little more than comfort, if even that. The prevailing reality was one of medical helplessness in the face of overwhelming suffering. A worker who became too sick or too badly injured to continue laboring was no longer of any value to the imperial project. They became a burden. The grim reality is that many were likely left behind to die, abandoned by their work gangs as they moved on. Others might have been hastily buried, sometimes, as legend chillingly suggests, within the wall's massive structure itself, or in unmarked graves nearby. Disease and injury were not just causes of death, they were the precursors to a final, lonely, and unceremonious end, the ultimate testament to why it sucked to be a worker on the Great Wall. The Great Wall of China, a monument of stone and earth, is also a monument to immeasurable human suffering. While we've explored the brutal labor, the harsh terrains, and the ravages of disease and injury, there is another layer of torment, perhaps the most profound, the forced separation from home and family. For countless workers, the summons to the wall was not just a call to arduous duty, but a life sentence of exile from everything they held dear. Tonight we delve into these unseen scars, the emotional agony of lives torn apart by imperial decree, a pain that echoed long after the physical work ceased. This separation was far more than a temporary absence endured for a distant job. It was an uprooting, a violent severing of the bonds that gave life meaning, bonds with spouses, children, parents, and the ancestral village. In an agrarian society deeply rooted in family and community, to be forcibly removed and sent to a remote, dangerous frontier was to be cast into a living hell. The wall for these men was not just a line of defense for the empire, it was the barrier that kept them from love, from belonging, from life itself. Their hearts remained broken, far behind them. Imagine the scene, imperial officials backed by soldiers arriving in a peaceful village, their purpose to levy manpower for the emperor's great project. Names are called, quotas filled, young men, husbands, fathers are singled out, often with little warning and no recourse. Protests are met with threats or violence. The act of conscription was a brutal assertion of state power over individual lives, a cold, bureaucratic process that shattered families in an instant. There were no appeals, no considerations for personal hardship. The demand for labor was absolute and unforgiving. The farewells, if any were permitted, were undoubtedly scenes of unimaginable grief, tears of wives clinging to husbands, the bewildered cries of children watching their fathers being marched away, the silent despair of elderly parents seeing their support and lineage forcibly removed. These were not departures for a foreseeable journey, but often a final, agonizing goodbye. The men would carry the memory of these last, tear-stained embraces as both a cherished treasure and an unendurable torment throughout their ordeal on the wall, a constant reminder of all they had lost. Following the traumatic separation was the arduous journey to the wall itself. This often involved being herded in gangs, sometimes shackled like criminals, across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain. The journey itself was fraught with danger, disease, and exhaustion. As they traveled further and further from their homes, the sense of isolation and hopelessness would deepen. Each mile covered was another mile separating them from their loved ones, another step into a desolate, unknown future from which return seemed increasingly improbable. The wall was not just a destination, it was an exile. Once at the wall, amidst the back-breaking labor and constant threat of death, a worker's mind would inevitably drift to those left behind. The primary concern for peasant conscripts was the survival of their families. Who would till the fields? Who would plant and harvest the crops? The absence of their labor could mean the difference between sustenance and starvation for their wives, children, and elderly parents. Gnawing anxiety, the constant worry for the well-being of loved ones facing hardship alone, added an unbearable layer of psychological torture to their physical suffering. This worry was compounded by a profound sense of helplessness. They were powerless to protect their families, powerless to provide for them from the distant, brutal frontier. Every mouthful of their meager rations might have been tainted with the guilt of knowing their children could be hungry. Every night spent shivering in a crude hut was accompanied by the fear that their loved ones were suffering even greater privations. This burden of responsibility, coupled with the inability to act, was a heavy stone upon their hearts. crushing their spirits as surely as the physical labor crushed their bodies. In an age without modern communication, news traveled slowly and unreliably, if at all. The chances of a letter penned by a literate worker or dictated by an illiterate one reaching its destination across vast distances and through chaotic administrative channels were slim. Similarly, news from home rarely penetrated the isolated work camps along the wall. This enforced silence, this agonizing lack of knowledge about the fate of their families, was a unique form of torture. Were they safe? Were they healthy? Were they even still alive? The unknown was a constant, tormenting void. Even if a letter was sent, carried by a rare traveler or an official courier, its journey was perilous. It could be lost, stolen, or simply discarded by indifferent intermediaries. For families back home, the absence of news from their conscripted men was equally agonizing. Each passing season without word would diminish hope, leading to a slow, painful acceptance of probable loss. This communication breakdown meant that both the workers and their families existed in separate, silent worlds of grief and uncertainty. Their emotional connections stretched to the breaking point, then often snapped. Back in the villages, the families of conscripted workers faced their own desperate struggles. Wives were left to manage farms and raise children alone, becoming, in effect, widows while their husbands still lived. Elderly parents lost their primary caregivers and source of support in their old age. Children grew up without knowing their fathers, their image fading into a half-forgotten memory or a tale of sorrow. The social fabric of communities was torn, with many households plunged into poverty and despair due to the loss of their able-bodied men to the emperor's insatiable wall. The economic impact on these communities could be severe. Fields might lie fallow, local crafts decline, and the overall productivity of a village diminish. Beyond the economic strain, there was the collective grief, the shared anxiety, and the constant presence of loss. The sight of women struggling alone, of fatherless children, was a daily reminder of the wall's heavy toll. This widespread bereavement and hardship created deep scars within the rural society that provided the bulk of the labor, scars that would endure for generations, passed down in stories and quiet laments. For many workers, being sent to the Great Wall was indeed perceived as a living death sentence. The chances of surviving years of brutal labor, disease, accidents, and malnutrition were slim. Even if one did survive, the prospect of ever returning home was remote. The vast distances, the lack of means for independent travel, and the possibility of being reconscripted meant that most were trapped indefinitely, who were alive, yet dead to their former lives, their families, their communities. This limbo was a cruel and unusual form of punishment for men whose only crime was often simply being born a peasant. Day by day, the relentless hardship and the seemingly permanent separation would chip away at a worker's hope. The memories of home, once a source of comfort, could become a source of unbearable pain. What was the point of surviving another day if there was no prospect of reunion, no return to a life of meaning and love? Some might have clung to a sliver of hope, while others succumbed to despair, their identities as husbands, fathers, and sons slowly eroding under the weight of their sentence. They became mere numbers, expendable cogs in the wall's construction. The profound sorrow of these separations found its way into Chinese folklore. The most famous tale is that of Munjiang Nu, whose husband was conscripted to work on the wall. When she traveled to bring him winter clothes, she discovered he had died. Her bitter weeping was so powerful, the legend says, that a section of the wall collapsed, revealing his bones. While a legend, this story powerfully encapsulates the grief, the loss, and the injustice felt by countless families torn apart by the wall's construction, a testament to the deep emotional wounds inflicted upon the populace. For a vast number of these men, the separation from their families proved to be eternal. They perished on the frontier, their bodies buried in unmarked graves, or, as whispered in hushed tones, incorporated into the wall itself. They never saw their children grow up, never returned to embrace their wives, never again sat in the familiar comfort of their village homes. Their names were largely forgotten, their individual stories lost, but their collective sacrifice, born of forced separation and enduring love for those they left behind, is a tragic, silent narrative woven into the very fabric of the Great Wall. Thus, the story of why it sucked to be a worker on the Great Wall is incomplete without acknowledging this profound emotional devastation. The physical hardships were immense, but the constant ache of separation, the worry for loved ones, the despair of a life sentence away from all that mattered, these were the wounds that cut deepest. The Great Wall was built not only with stone, earth, and the blood of its laborers, but also with their broken hearts, their shattered dreams, and the enduring sorrow of families forever torn asunder by an emperor's will. This was perhaps its cruelest and most lasting human cost. The monumental scale of the Great Wall of China was matched only by the monumental effort required to build it. To extract such labor from a vast, often unwilling workforce, imperial authorities relied not on inspiration or reward, but on a ruthless system of oversight and punishment. This was a regime where control was forged in fear, where the overseer's shadow loomed as large as the wall itself. Tonight we explore this brutal aspect of the wall's construction, the ever-present threat of the lash and the sword that defined the daily existence of its builders and underscored just how deeply their ordeal sucked. The grueling tasks, the unforgiving terrain, the meager rations, and the rampant disease already painted a grim picture of life on the wall. However, layered upon these physical miseries was the constant psychological torment inflicted by a system designed to enforce absolute obedience. The men who toiled on the wall were not merely laborers. They were cogs in a vast machine, driven by fear and subjected to the arbitrary will of those who held power over them. This element of human cruelty, systematically applied, was a defining feature of their suffering, a key to understanding the true cost of the wall. A strict hierarchy of command ensured that the emperor's will cascaded down to the lowest laborer. At the top were imperial officials and generals like Meng Tian under Qin Shi Huang, responsible for vast sections of the wall and answerable directly to the emperor. Beneath them were layers of military officers, supervisors, and foremen, each tasked with overseeing specific work gangs and ensuring that construction quotas were met. This chain of command was designed for efficiency in labor extraction, but it also created a system where pressure and brutality were passed down relentlessly. Overseers at every level faced immense pressure from their superiors to deliver results. Failure to meet ambitious construction targets or to maintain discipline among the workforce could result in severe punishment for the overseers themselves, including demotion, beatings, or even execution. This constant threat from above often translated into increased ruthlessness towards the laborers below. Many taskmasters, driven by fear for their own positions or by inherent cruelty, ruled their sections of the wall with an iron fist, fostering an atmosphere of terror to compel compliance from their charges. The most common instrument of punishment and coercion was the whip or lash. Made of leather, bamboo, or other pliant materials, its sharp crack would have been a terrifyingly familiar sound along the wall. The lash was used for a multitude of perceived offenses, working too slowly, taking an unauthorized rest, displaying a moment of defiance, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was a tool of instant painful discipline, designed to keep workers moving, to remind them of their subservient status, and to instill a constant, gnawing fear of physical pain. The application of the lash was often arbitrary, dependent on the whim and temper of the individual overseer. A worker already weakened by hunger and exhaustion might find their pace slowing, only to be met with a stinging blow rather than any understanding. The pain of the whip on already sore and tired muscles, on skin perhaps broken by previous beatings or harsh conditions, was a daily agony for many. This constant threat of immediate physical punishment created an environment where workers toiled not just against the elements and materials, but against the ever-watchful eyes of their tormentors. While the lash was for daily enforcement, the sword, or other bladed weapons like axes and spears wielded by guards and overseers, represented the ultimate sanction, the power of life and death. These weapons were not merely for defense against external enemies, they were a potent symbol of the state's authority over the lives of its laborers. The glint of steel served as a constant, silent warning that resistance or serious infractions would be met with swift and lethal force. This was the sharp edge of imperial power, always visible, always ready to be used. For more serious offenses, such as attempting to escape, inciting rebellion, assaulting an overseer, or repeated acts of gross insubordination, the punishment was often execution. These executions were frequently carried out publicly, sometimes with deliberate cruelty, to serve as a terrifying example to the rest of the workforce. The sight of a fellow worker being put to the sword, beheaded, or subjected to other forms of capital punishment would have had a chilling effect, quelling thoughts of resistance and reinforcing the absolute power of the supervisors. The accusation of laziness was a particularly dangerous one for a worker on the Great Wall. In the eyes of a demanding overseer, anyone not working at peak capacity, regardless of the reason, could be deemed lazy. A man stumbling from exhaustion, slowed by illness, or simply pausing to catch his breath after hauling a heavy load might find himself targeted. Since the wall's progress was paramount, any perceived slackening of pace was treated as a threat to the project's timeline and thus an offense punishable by immediate, often violent, correction. There was little room for human frailty. Insubordination could range from outright refusal to obey an order, an act of almost certain suicide, to something as subtle as a defiant glance, a muttered complaint, or a perceived lack of deference. In a system built on absolute authority and fear, overseers were acutely sensitive to any challenge, real or imagined, to their power. A worker who questioned a command or who simply failed to display the expected level of submission could face brutal retribution. The line between acceptable behavior and punishable insubordination was often thin and arbitrarily drawn by the person in power. The entire system of oversight and punishment was geared towards one primary goal: maximizing productivity and ensuring the rapid completion of the Great Wall. Imperial edicts demanded progress, and this pressure was transmitted down the chain of command, culminating in the relentless driving of the workforce. Workers were pushed beyond the limits of human endurance, forced to labor from before dawn until after dusk, often 7 days a week, with little regard for their physical or mental well-being. The wall had to rise, and human suffering was deemed an acceptable, if not necessary, price for its construction. Work gangs were often assigned specific quotas: a certain length of wall to be completed, a certain amount of stone to be quarried or transported within a set time frame. Failure to meet these quotas could bring collective punishment upon the entire gang, or severe retribution for the individuals deemed responsible. This created an environment of intense pressure, where workers might even drive each other, fearing the consequences of falling behind. The toil was ceaseless, the demands unending, all enforced by the menacing presence of the overseers and their instruments of pain. Living under such a regime of constant fear had a profound psychological impact on the workers. The ever-present threat of violence, the arbitrary nature of punishment, and the powerlessness of their situation could lead to chronic anxiety, depression, and a sense of utter hopelessness. This perpetual state of fear eroded human dignity, discouraged camaraderie, as informants might exist, and made an already unbearable existence even more difficult to endure. It was a mental attrition that complemented the physical breakdown caused by labor and deprivation. For most workers, survival depended on maintaining a posture of complete submission and uncomplaining obedience. They learned to suppress their emotions, to endure pain silently, and to avoid drawing the attention of the overseers. Any display of individuality or spirit could be dangerously misinterpreted. This forced subservience, while a necessary strategy for staying alive, was itself a form of deep psychological injury, stripping away autonomy and reinforcing their status as little more than enslaved beasts of burden, their lives dictated by the whims of others. While individual punishment was common, there were likely instances of collective punishment, where an entire work unit would suffer for the perceived infraction of one or a few. If a quota was missed, tools were broken through alleged negligence, or an escape occurred from a particular gang, all members might face beatings, reduced rations, or even harsher labor assignments. This tactic served to further control the workforce by turning workers against each other, making them responsible for policing their own ranks to avoid drawing the ire of the overseers upon the entire group. The lash and the sword were not merely tools, they were symbols of the brutal philosophy that underpinned the Great Wall's construction: that human life was expendable in service of the emperor's ambition. This system of ruthless oversight and savage punishment was designed to extract every last ounce of effort from a terrified workforce, ensuring that the wall rose no matter the human cost. The fear it instilled, the pain it inflicted, and the lives it casually extinguished are an indelible part of why it truly, deeply sucked to be a worker on this monumental yet monstrous project. The path to understanding why it truly sucked to be a worker on the Great Wall of China is paved with hardship. We've journeyed through the crushing labor, the unforgiving terrains, the starvation diets, the rampant diseases, and the brutal reign of overseers. Each of these elements contributed to a horrifyingly high mortality rate among the workforce. Tonight we confront the inevitable, grim consequence of such suffering. What became of the countless workers who perished? We delve into the somber reality of their final resting places, exploring how the Great Wall earned its chilling moniker as the Wall of Bones. The silence of the historical record on individual lives is deafening, but the collective fate of the dead echoes through legends and the very landscape. When a worker succumbed to exhaustion, accident, illness, or the overseer's wrath, there was little pause in the relentless drive to build. The empire demanded its wall, and the lives of those who fell were often treated as just another expendable resource, their bodies disposed of with grim practicality rather than sacred reverence. This chapter is about those final indignities, the unmarked graves, and the enduring legacy of a monument built on human remains. Pinpointing the exact number of deaths during the centuries of the Great Wall's construction is an impossible task for historians. Records are fragmented, lost, or were never kept with the precision we expect today, especially for common laborers, convicts, or prisoners of war. However, conservative estimates consistently suggest that hundreds of thousands perished. Some scholars and popular accounts even place the figure at over 1 million lives lost across the various dynasties that undertook major wall-building efforts. This staggering scale of death is almost incomprehensible. This grim toll is why the Great Wall is often referred to not just as a marvel of engineering, but also as the longest cemetery on Earth, or, in some traditions, the Wall of Tears. Each stone, each foot of rammed earth, could be said to represent a measure of human suffering, and far too often a human life cut short. The sheer volume of fatalities transforms sections of the frontier into vast, linear burial grounds, a silent testament to the immense human cost of this imperial ambition, a cost borne by the weakest and most vulnerable. The causes of death were as varied as they were relentless. As we've explored, workers fell from treacherous heights, were crushed by falling stones, or succumbed to heat stroke in desert sun and frostbite in mountain blizzards. Malnutrition weakened their bodies, making them easy prey for dysentery, cholera, typhus, and a host of other infectious diseases that thrived in unsanitary conditions. And for those who faltered, showed defiance, or attempted escape, summary execution by the sword was a swift and brutal end. Death was a constant, familiar presence along the wall. Faced with such widespread mortality, especially in remote and difficult-to-access locations, the imperial administration and its overseers had a grim logistical problem: what to do with the bodies. Transporting deceased laborers back to their home villages, hundreds or even thousands of miles away, was an unthinkable expense and effort, especially when living workers needed to be supplied. The priority was always the unceasing progress of the wall. Consequently, the disposal of the dead was typically swift, unceremonious, and localized. The most common fate for a worker who died was to be buried on site or very close to where they fell. There was no time or inclination for elaborate funeral preparations or the careful selection of auspicious burial plots. Graves were often shallow, dug hastily into the unforgiving earth by fellow laborers who knew their own turn might come soon. Sometimes, multiple bodies were interred in mass graves, with no individual markers to commemorate their existence or identify them for any grieving family who might one day search. These unmarked graves dotted the landscape along the wall's route, often becoming indistinguishable from the surrounding terrain as time passed. Exposed to the elements and sometimes disturbed by wild animals, these resting places offered little dignity. For the workers, the knowledge that this would likely be their end, a forgotten corpse in a shallow pit far from ancestral lands, must have added another layer of despair to their already burdened spirits. It was an end devoid of honor, comfort, or remembrance. Perhaps the most enduring and chilling legend associated with the Great Wall's dead is that many were not just buried near the wall, but within it. Folklore, poems, and popular imagination have long held that the bodies of deceased workers were sometimes incorporated directly into the foundations, or mixed with the earth and rubble used to fill the massive ramparts. This image of the wall being literally built on and with human remains is a potent and horrifying one, symbolizing the ultimate sacrifice extracted from its builders. Archaeological evidence for the widespread, systematic burial of bodies within the core structure of the Great Wall is limited and debated among scholars. While some human remains have been found near or in associated structures, the idea of this being a universal practice for disposing of the majority of the dead is not strongly supported by current findings. However, this doesn't mean it never happened, especially in moments of extreme haste or callousness. The legend itself speaks volumes about the perceived expendability of the workers. It's more probable that many workers were buried in the earth used to create the massive embankments supporting the stone facings, or in the fill between inner and outer walls, or directly beneath the wall's foundations in the construction trench. Whether inside the masonry or directly under it, the distinction might have mattered little to the symbolism. The legend gained power because it reflected a deeper truth. The wall consumed lives, and those lives became, in a way, part of its very substance, their energy and essence subsumed by the colossal project. The lack of proper burial rites was a matter of profound cultural and spiritual significance in ancient China. Traditional beliefs emphasized the importance of a good burial for the peace of the deceased's spirit and the well-being of their living descendants. This involved specific rituals, appropriate grave goods, burial in ancestral clan cemeteries, and ongoing remembrance through ancestral veneration. To die far from home and be interred without these rites was a terrible fate, believed to lead to a restless, aggrieved spirit. For the families left behind, the knowledge that their loved one was not only dead but also improperly buried would have been a source of immense and lasting sorrow and anxiety. They were denied the chance to mourn according to custom, to ensure the spiritual well-being of the deceased, and to maintain the vital connection with their ancestors. This spiritual homelessness inflicted upon the dead workers compounded the emotional trauma of their loss, creating ripples of grief that extended far beyond the individual death. Thus, the Great Wall became more than a defensive barrier. It evolved in the collective consciousness into a vast, linear tomb, a resting place for countless unwilling souls. Each watchtower could be seen as a headstone, each mile of rampart a mass grave. This perception wasn't just born of legends, but from the undeniable reality that hundreds of thousands of men vanished into its construction, their individual stories dissolving into the larger, tragic narrative of the wall's creation. Their final anonymity was a stark testament to their value in the eyes of the state. The term Wall of Bones, therefore, is not mere hyperbole. While perhaps not every brick is mortared with human ash, the entire edifice is built upon a foundation of unimaginable human loss. The high death toll, the perfunctory disposal of bodies, the denial of proper burial rites, and the enduring legends of remains within its very structure all contribute to this grim understanding. The final resting places of these workers, or lack thereof, were the ultimate indignity in a life already stripped bare of comfort and hope. In reflecting on why it sucked to be a worker on the Great Wall, the fate of their mortal remains serves as a final, chilling punctuation. To labor unto death was one thing. To be denied even a modicum of dignity in that death, to become mere fill or an unmarked mound in a desolate landscape, was another entirely. The Great Wall stands today as a wonder of the world, but it is a wonder forever haunted by the silent, unnumbered, and unmourned dead who form its truest, most tragic foundation. The Great Wall of China, a structure born from imperial ambition, was built upon a foundation of human suffering that extended far beyond the visible torments of physical labor. We have explored the brutal conditions, the meager sustenance, the rampant disease, and the ever-present threat of the lash. But tonight, we venture into the internal landscape of the worker, to consider the profound psychological toll exacted by this colossal undertaking. Beyond the aching muscles and broken bodies were minds stretched to their limits by monotony, isolation, hopelessness, and fear, a daily chipping away at the very essence of their humanity. To truly understand why it sucked to be a worker on the Great Wall, we must acknowledge that the assault was not just on the body, but on the spirit. The relentless grind, the endless vistas of barren land or impassable mountains, the constant dread, and the profound sense of being forgotten by the world, all converged to create an inner prison far more confining than any physical barrier. This was a mental anguish that for many was as debilitating and ultimately as fatal as any physical ailment or injury they might endure. Consider first the crushing monotony of the labor. Day after day, from before sunrise until well after sunset, the tasks were largely the same: quarrying stone, hauling earth, tamping soil, lifting heavy materials. There was little variation, little call for creativity or individual skill beyond the most basic, repetitive actions. This endless cycle of grueling, unthinking work could deaden the mind, reducing a thinking, feeling human being to little more than a beast of burden, a mere component in a vast, unfeeling machine. This repetitive strain on the mind, the lack of intellectual stimulation or any sense of personal achievement beyond surviving another day, could lead to a profound sense of dehumanization. Workers were not seen as individuals with hopes and dreams, but as expendable units of labor. This perception, relentlessly reinforced by their treatment, could easily be internalized. The spirit would grow numb, the world would shrink to the immediate task at hand, and the horizon of possibility would narrow to the point of vanishing altogether. Then there was the profound isolation. We've touched upon the remoteness of the wall's construction sites, often situated hundreds if not thousands of miles from the workers' homes and villages. This geographical separation translated into an equally profound social and emotional isolation. Torn from their families, their communities, their ancestral lands, and everything familiar, they were thrust into a harsh, alien environment, populated by strangers, fellow sufferers, and brutal overseers. True human connection was a rare and precious commodity. The absence of letters from home, the lack of news from the outside world, the sheer impossibility of maintaining contact with loved ones, deepened this sense of being utterly alone and forgotten. Imagine the ache of not knowing if your spouse was coping, if your children were healthy, if your parents were still alive. This constant unanswered yearning, this feeling of being adrift in a hostile wilderness with no anchor to one's past or future, could erode the will to live and foster a deep, pervasive loneliness that chilled the soul. Compounding this was the overwhelming hopelessness of the task. The Great Wall stretched for unimaginable distances, its construction spanning not just years but generations. For the individual worker, the end of their toil was nowhere in sight. Even if they survived one section, there was always another mountain to conquer, another desert to cross. The sheer scale of the project, relative to their tiny individual contribution, could make their efforts feel futile, a drop of sweat in an ocean of suffering, leading to a sense of inescapable doom. The chances of surviving years of such hardship to eventually return home were perceived, quite rightly, as slim. This made their forced labor feel less like a temporary service and more like a life sentence, or even a slow death sentence, as we've discussed. This absence of a foreseeable end, this lack of any tangible reward or prospect of liberation, could extinguish the faintest flicker of hope, leaving behind only a grim resignation to an unbearable fate. It was an existence devoid of a future. Constant fear was another corrosive element in this psychological crucible. Fear of the overseer's whip or sword for any perceived infraction. Fear of accidents that could maim or kill in an instant. Fear of the diseases that swept through the camps. Fear of starvation from inadequate rations. Fear of the harsh elements, the freezing cold, the scorching heat. Living in a perpetual state of high alert, never knowing where the next threat would come from, exhausts the mind and shatters any sense of peace or security. This pervasive anxiety permeated every aspect of their lives. It dictated their interactions, making them wary and subservient. It haunted their meager moments of rest, preventing true recuperation. It poisoned their thoughts, making it difficult to find solace or distraction. The world became a landscape of potential dangers, and every unfamiliar sound or sudden movement could trigger a jolt of adrenaline. Such prolonged exposure to extreme stress inevitably wears down even the strongest mental defenses, leading to lasting psychological scars. The cumulative effect of monotony, isolation, hopelessness, and fear was often a descent into profound despair. This was not mere sadness, but a deep, existential anguish, a conviction that life had lost all meaning and value. When the present is unbearable and the future offers no relief, despair can take root, consuming what little remains of a person's spirit. It is a darkness that colors all perception, making it an already grim reality appear even more bleak and unendurable. Manifestations of such despair could vary. Some might have fallen into a state of profound apathy, going through the motions of labor like automatons, their inner light extinguished. Others might have become prone to fits of rage or uncontrollable grief. For some, the mental strain could have tipped into what we might now recognize as severe depression or even psychosis. The historical records are largely silent on these individual struggles, but the conditions were undeniably ripe for widespread psychological breakdown. In the face of such overwhelming and inescapable suffering, resignation often became the dominant state of mind for many. This was not necessarily a passive giving up, but perhaps a grim, necessary psychological adaptation. To constantly fight against, or even to fully feel, the sheer horror of their situation would be to invite madness. Resignation could be a way to numb the pain, to create a mental distance from the suffering, to simply put one foot in front of the other and endure the unendurable, day after agonizing day. Yet, even in the darkest pits of human suffering, faint glimmers of humanity can persist. It is conceivable that amidst the shared ordeal, bonds of camaraderie and mutual support formed among some workers. A shared glance of understanding, a secretly offered piece of bread, a word of comfort in a native dialect. These small acts of kindness, though perhaps rare and risky, could have provided fleeting moments of solace and a reminder of their shared humanity in a system designed to strip it away. The question of resistance in such a brutal system is complex. Open, organized rebellion was almost unthinkable, given the overwhelming power of the state and the certainty of savage reprisal. However, resistance can take many forms. Perhaps it was found in small, individual acts of defiance, like feigning illness for a day's respite, or working deliberately slowly when the overseer's back was turned, though these two carried immense risks. More often, resistance was likely internal, the struggle to maintain a sense of self, to hold on to memories of loved ones, to refuse to let the spirit be entirely crushed. Ultimately, the psychological toll of building the Great Wall was an intrinsic and devastating part of why it truly sucked to be a worker. Their minds were besieged as relentlessly as their bodies. The monotony, isolation, hopelessness, and fear were not side effects of the labor. They were fundamental to the experience. Deliberately or incidentally fostered by the system, the Great Wall of China stands as a monument to imperial power, but it is equally a monument to the shattered spirits and the enduring mental anguish of the millions who were sacrificed to raise it from the unforgiving earth. After journeying through the myriad horrors that define the life of a Great Wall worker, the back-breaking labor, the unforgiving landscape, The gnawing hunger, the rampant disease, the brutal punishments, and the profound emotional desolation, we arrive at a critical juncture. We must now attempt to weigh this almost unimaginable human suffering against the perceived purpose and alleged success of the Great Wall itself. Was this colossal undertaking, which consumed so many lives and caused such widespread misery, ultimately a triumph of engineering and defense, or a monumental folly built on a foundation of tears and blood? The Great Wall of China, in its various iterations across centuries, stands as one of humanity's most ambitious construction projects. Its image is one of enduring strength, a formidable dragon of stone and earth winding across a vast continent. But as we've seen, its construction was a brutal saga. The question that hangs heavy in the air, heavy with the ghosts of its builders, is whether its strategic achievements could ever justify the immense human cost. Tonight we reflect on the wall's success and try to balance it on the scales against the undeniable weight of its human toll. The primary intended purpose of the Great Wall, particularly the sections built by dynasties like the Qin and Ming, was undeniably defensive. It was conceived as a formidable barrier to protect the sedentary agricultural civilization of China from the swift and unpredictable raids of nomadic peoples from the northern steppes, such as the Xiongnu, the Mongols, and later the Manchus. The vision was one of an impenetrable shield, securing the empire's borders, ensuring peace within, and allowing Chinese culture and society to flourish without constant external threat. Beyond simple defense, the wall was also intended to serve as a means of border control, regulating trade and movement. Its watchtowers were designed as an early warning system, capable of relaying news of enemy movements quickly across vast distances. Furthermore, the wall was a potent symbol of imperial power and determination, a clear demarcation between the civilized world within and the barbarian lands beyond. It was meant to project an image of an unassailable, unified empire, confident in its strength and its boundaries. In certain periods and specific locations, the Great Wall did indeed fulfill some of these intended functions. Its presence could channel nomadic raiders towards more heavily defended passes or discourage smaller raiding parties altogether. The system of garrisons and watchtowers provided a crucial first line of defense, buying time for imperial armies to mobilize and respond to larger incursions. It could also offer a degree of security for trade routes like the Silk Road, where sections of the wall protected vital corridors and oases. There were undoubtedly moments in history when the wall played a significant role in military engagements, serving as a fortified line from which to repel attacks, or as a secure base for launching counteroffensives. The Ming dynasty, in particular, invested heavily in stone and brick fortifications that were formidable obstacles. For the soldiers stationed there, despite the hardships, the wall could represent a tangible advantage, a bulwark against a feared enemy, and its successful defense could be a source of pride and relief for the empire. However, the overall effectiveness of the Great Wall as an impenetrable defense throughout its long history is highly debatable among historians. It was never a single, continuous barrier built at one time. Rather, it was a series of often disconnected walls built by different dynasties with varying levels of quality and strategic placement. Many sections were made of rammed earth, which, while durable, was more susceptible to erosion and attack than later stone and brick construction. Its sheer length made it incredibly difficult to effectively garrison. Nomadic groups, renowned for their mobility and adaptability, frequently found ways to circumvent the wall. They could go around its ends, penetrate through sparsely defended sections, or exploit periods of disrepair. Gates, essential for trade and communication, also became points of vulnerability. Treachery from within, with guards being bribed or commanders defecting, sometimes rendered sections of the wall useless. Famously, the Mongols under Genghis Khan and later the Manchus were not ultimately stopped by the wall in their conquests of China. Moreover, the wall was not a static entity. Its effectiveness was entirely dependent on the strength and vigilance of the dynasty that manned it. During periods of internal weakness, corruption, or civil strife within China, the resources and manpower needed to maintain and garrison the wall often dwindled. Vast stretches would fall into disrepair, becoming little more than crumbling earthworks or isolated stone towers, easily breached or bypassed. The wall was only as strong as the empire behind it. The immense cost of construction was matched by the ongoing expense of maintenance and staffing. To keep even key sections adequately garrisoned and supplied required a constant drain on imperial resources. For many dynasties, this was a burden that competed with other pressing needs, such as internal infrastructure, famine relief, or offensive military campaigns. The decision to invest in the wall was always a strategic gamble, one whose returns were far from guaranteed over the long span of Chinese history. So we have a structure whose military and strategic success was at best intermittent and debatable. often depending on specific circumstances, locations, and the political climate of the time. While it undoubtedly offered some level of defense and border control in certain periods, it was by no means the foolproof, impenetrable shield it was often envisioned to be. It was a flawed, incredibly costly, and perpetually demanding defensive system that consumed vast resources. Now let us place this uncertain record of success back on the scales, opposite the undeniable and catastrophic human cost we have explored throughout our journey. Millions of lives were poured into its construction, lives of conscripted peasants, convicts, soldiers, and prisoners of war. These individuals were subjected to forced labor under the most brutal conditions imaginable. They faced treacherous terrains, extreme climates, starvation diets, rampant disease, and the constant threat of horrific punishment or accidental death. The physical suffering was immense, but so too was the emotional and psychological toll. Workers were torn from their families, often never to return, living with the constant anxiety for their loved ones' survival. They endured monotony, isolation, and a profound sense of hopelessness, their humanity systematically eroded by the brutal regime of construction. Their deaths were often unceremonious, their bodies left in unmarked graves, or, as legend suggests, even within the wall itself, denied the dignity of proper burial rites. From the perspective of these countless individuals and their grieving families, any strategic advantage the wall might have offered would have seemed an abstract and distant justification for their immediate, personal hell. Their lives were shattered, their communities decimated, their suffering absolute. The wall, for them, was not a symbol of security or imperial glory, but a monstrous devourer of life, a sentence to hard labor and an early grave, a source of unending sorrow. So the question resonates across the centuries: was it worth it? From a purely pragmatic, imperial viewpoint, some emperors and strategists might have argued yes, that any measure of defense, however flawed, was necessary in a dangerous world. They might point to periods of relative peace or successful repulsions of invaders as proof of its value. But this is a cold calculation, one that conveniently omits the staggering weight of human agony from the equation. For those who believe in the sanctity of individual human life and dignity, the answer is likely to be a resounding no. The Great Wall of China, while an awe-inspiring feat of engineering and a powerful symbol, stands as perhaps one of history's most stark reminders of the colossal price that can be paid for ambition and perceived security. For the workers who built it, whose names are lost to time but whose suffering is etched into every stone, the Great Wall was an unmitigated catastrophe, a testament to why their existence truly, profoundly. The Great Wall of China snakes across landscapes of breathtaking scale, an undeniable testament to human ambition and the colossal power of ancient empires. For centuries, it has stood as a symbol of strength, of engineering prowess, and of a civilization's determination to define and defend itself. Its iconic silhouette is recognized globally, evoking images of dynastic grandeur and a history stretching back into the mists of time. It is, without question, one of the most imposing structures ever conceived by humankind, a silent witness to the rise and fall of emperors and the relentless march of history through ages past. Yet, beneath this grand, imposing facade, beneath the veneer of imperial might and architectural wonder, lies a far more somber and deeply human story. It is the story of millions of unsung individuals, the countless ordinary people whose names are lost to us, but whose lives were utterly consumed by the wall's relentless construction. These were the conscripted peasants, the banished convicts, the weary soldiers, each one a life interrupted, a future stolen, a soul poured into the earth and stone. Their individual hopes and fears were crushed under the immense weight of this imperial decree, their existence reduced to mere labor. Their unceasing toil, their profound suffering, their chronic exhaustion, and their often unceremonious, forgotten deaths are as much a part of the Great Wall as the bricks and mortar from which it is made. Every stone hauled up a treacherous mountainside, every basket of earth carried under a scorching sun, every inch of rampart raised against a freezing wind, carries the invisible imprint of their pain. The wall is not just a physical barrier. It is a repository of human endurance pushed to its absolute limit and frequently, tragically, beyond that breaking point. Their silent stories are etched into its very fabric. So the next time you gaze upon an image of this majestic, sprawling wonder, or perhaps even stand in its shadow, we invite you to look beyond its imposing beauty and strategic significance. Remember, if you will, the true and staggering price of its construction. Consider the generations of families torn apart, the communities decimated by the loss of their strongest hands, the agricultural lands left untended, and the pervasive fear that must have haunted those who knew the wall's insatiable hunger for human life. This knowledge adds a profound and necessary depth to our understanding of such ancient marvels. Remember the sheer unyielding force that compelled this labor, the absolute power of emperors who could command millions to such a fate. Remember the human will, so often bent and broken under the relentless pressure of brutal oversight, the sting of the lash, and the chilling finality of the sword. Think of the bodies, malnourished and overworked, succumbing to disease, to horrific accidents, to the extremes of climate. Their physical forms literally sacrificed to raise these ramparts. Each section of the wall is a monument built upon this profound sacrifice of flesh and spirit. And remember, too, the silent screams that seem to echo across the millennia from those desolate northern frontiers. Listen closely with the ear of empathy, and you might just perceive the anguish of those who perished far from home, without comfort, without proper burial rites. Their remains sometimes lost within or beside the very structure they were forced to build. The chilling moniker, the Wall of Bones, is more than just a macabre legend. It is a stark acknowledgement of the countless, unrecorded dead whose final resting place became this immense, linear tomb stretching across the land. We've journeyed together through some very dark corridors of the past tonight, exploring the harsh realities faced by those who built this extraordinary monument. The aim, as always, with our boring history is not to sensationalize, but to quietly reflect, to understand the complexities behind the grand narratives, and perhaps to find a measure of empathy for those whose experiences are so often overlooked. Thank you for lending your time and your attention as we've uncovered why it so deeply, truly sucked to be a worker on the Great Wall of China. We hope this journey has been peacefully enlightening. And so, as the echoes of their toil fade into the quiet of your evening and the immense silent wall recedes into the landscape of your mind, we bid you farewell. May the weight of this history settle gently, not as a burden to keep you from rest, but as a soft, monotonous hum to usher you towards slumber. We hope these tales of ancient hardship have, paradoxically, brought you to a place of peace. Until our next exploration of the past, may your dreams be undisturbed, your sleep long and profoundly deep, and may all your history, when you next seek it before bedtime, remain as wonderfully and reliably boring as we aim for. Sleep well and good night.